Good. I'm going to make it worse. First off, let me thank the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Jean-Luc Plessis and CK Lau for having us here and for the opportunity to present here. Not only am I going to be possibly controversial, I'm also not a company lawyer, so do feel free to doze off, do whatever you think is more important at this particular point in time. My claim for being here is that I did write an article on soft law codes, and specifically on the UK Code of Corporate Governance. Another one is that I work at Cass Business School, which is based at City University in London, and we run a couple of national projects in which we get quite a lot of people from the city in to discuss corporate governance related themes. We will be discussing tax at the 28th of February, 28th of April, so that will be interesting at this particular point in time. And the last thing is that we run an international project in which we try to get as many stakeholders as we can into the room, and mostly the important ones, to discuss whether we can find some kind of embedded best practices in relation to corporate governance, which would allow us to find different ways of looking at corporate governance from a bottom-up perspective, and to see if there's anything out there that would allow us to do things differently. One of the things that I could take out of there is that in Netherlands we were involved in the redraft of the Corporate Governance Code, and one of the things they put in there is that from 3% shareholdings you have to disclose your strategic view on the company for the next 10 years. That is because, obviously, in the ABN AMRO affair, they had the Children's Investment Fund come in with their 3% holding and make an argument that ABN AMRO had to split up, and we know what happened after that, right? Okay, so that's one of the things that I think should be out there, right? I mean, there should be some sort of international project in which we take stock of these international best practices, and there's a lot which sort of diverts from Cadbury and the UK Code. So let's first have a look at that. Is this how it works? Yes. We will be taking a quick look at soft law corporate governance, empirical issues with it, political economy issues derived from it, and then the implicit assumptions behind the code. So soft law, right? Soft law, Abbott and Snydel identified as a deviation from hard law that begins with a weakening of legal arrangements. It offers many advantages, and it has obviously become the norm for regulation around the world in relation to corporate governance, right? Global Compact adopts it, EU Green Paper adopts it. The background of the Cadbury Code, the start of the UK Code of Corporate Governance, was a series of ongoing corporate scandals. Barings Bank, Bank for Credit and Commerce International, Polypack, Maxwell Mirror Group pensions, but especially the accounting profession, which had huge troubles after this because the integrity was questioned after all these scandals. Market monitoring in general was questioned by the public. It was in that particular perspective that Cadbury was asked to become the chairman of a committee that was put in place by the London Stock Exchange, Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, and a number of government institutions. Well, one of the interesting things about the Cadbury report and about Cadbury's chairmanship is that nobody actually knows who set the agenda and who set the membership of the committee when it was formed. Even Cadbury himself didn't know. All right? That's interesting. You become chairman of one of the most notable committees in the world on soft law. You don't know who actually provided the membership for the committee that you were going to chair. Right? So the Cadbury report was followed by a large number of updates and review, which became known as the UK Code of Corporate Governance, aka also known as the UK Code. Right? UK Code is soft law throughout, right? It provides a comply or explain approach, no one size fits all, there's no tick box, and the implicit assumption behind it is that the reflections by the board should be done on the spirit of the code rather than the letter of it, right? So we assume that the code will lead to active and not passive compliance. And the explicit assumption behind it was that the code would be a private sector arrangement that would be monitored by vigilant market agents, and the role of it was to forestall government intervention, government regulation in the wake of the many accounting scandals at the start of the 90s. It was hugely successful, had an immense international impact. Nearly every corporate governance development in the UK and throughout the world in the past decades has derived much of its content and inspiration from the Cadbury Report. It's a blueprint. It's become adopted by national regulators and standard setters, and there's quite some nice research being done right now which says that even if local ownership control systems are very different, people will adopt it. There's good work by Ulf Larsson Olaisen, who's been looking at the Swedish system, which is mostly dominated by dominant owners, where they try to sort of work with the language of the code and reframe it in such a way that they can still be working within their own system, but they will still adopt the implicit or the explicit language of the code. There's a couple of issues with it. There are empirical issues, normative issues, and implicit regulation issues. Empirical issues. The claim would be that private regulation leads to monitoring of corporate governance through the dissemination and identification of best practice. At a corporate level, that would mean constant adjustments to corporate strategy on the basis of reflection on the spirit of the code, active reflection on the spirit of the code. Right? On the code level, there's an assumption that there will be a constant revision of the code and its assumptions. Compliance with the code would become a listing requirement, and there would be an ongoing interactive reflection on goals of corporate governance by a lot of different stakeholders who would become involved in this. Right? This was at the start of the 90s. This was very, very clearly in the press. There were a lot of people who were arguing that the code would become this living document that everybody could get involved with over time. So therefore, you would also have all these reviews and revisions that would make it something that would change over time. However, what do we find in practice? In practice, we find a widespread non-compliance with best practices identified in and by the code. Most notably, the fact that at Cadbury's, they lagged quite a while to separate their CEO and chairman roles, right? There's a widespread failure to provide adequate explanation. There's mention of boilerplate reporting, as Andrew Key can testify. At the code level, revisions are controlled by a very limited number of city institutions, rather than the broader set of institutions that was involved at the moment of drafting the code. There's an unclear nomination process and goal setting in the code. As I indicated before, Cadbury didn't know who was actually who actually set the goals and the membership of his own committee. The background agency and continuous background agency of government agencies in the drafting and in the continuous use of the code is being obscured. It's produced by the FSC. It's not very clear in the codes who's actually involved in redrafting and keeping it alive. But the main thing, I think, is that the same failing proposals get represented in every revision. And you can list them, and you will find them, whatever happens, even in the Walker Report after 2008, right? And after the financial crisis, it listed exactly the same proposals as had been listed before by Cadbury in 1992, right? Comply or explain, no external regulation, enhancement of market monitoring, strengthening financial disclosure, splitting the roles of chairman and CEO, strengthening the net role, better stewardship of institutional shareholders, and change centered on cultural and behavioral processes in individuals and boards. That's it, right? Nothing changes over time in the code. The tenets of the code itself are never questioned. There's never a revision on the code level itself. Right? The only thing that's in there which would be mandatory is this listing requirement at the LSE, but that's considered a nuclear option, so it doesn't produce anything in terms of change. The claim would be that vigilant markets and market actors would actually provide some active monitoring over what the code is doing. However, what do we find, for instance, in the case of Tesco, right? Failing mechanisms for self-regulation. 250 million pounds inflated profit forecast just before the new boss took the seat. And it was not the non-execs, it was not the ethics committee or the audit committee, but a whistleblower who brought it out, right? This is a complete failure of corporate governance mechanisms. PwC, sign of the books, had been its auditor since 1983, right? Something is not going well there, right? They are obviously part of the Big Four. The Big Four have their own problems and we're well aware of it, right? Market monitoring. Share price reacted only after the fact. Buffett sold too late. There was an expansion of major shareholdings, including by the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, just before the scandal broke out. There was no market pricing involved in this scandal, right? Institutional shareholder performance was almost absent in this case. Cadbury, when he wrote the code, said that we need the code to actually forestall government intervention. So therefore, active compliance by all parties involved would be a necessary feature to actually make sure that mandatory regulation would not become a part of the way that regulation is provided in relation to corporate governance. We have not seen a reconsideration of the code after 2008. We haven't seen it after Tesco. We haven't seen it after all the ongoing corporate governance scandals that have been taking place over the last 20 years. Now, this is my more controversial point, political economy issues, right? So the explicit normativity of the UK code would be that there would be something like enlightened self-interest in boards, in executives, and in market parties, specifically in institutional investors, right? Last bit is obviously repeated in the stewardship code. Stewardship code being set up because institutional investors did not engage, so they had to be reminded of their implicit role in this corporate governance field. However, if you look closely at the code and you dissect what it actually says, it very directly attributes ownership as such to shareholders. Well, every company lawyer can tell you that shareholders are not owners, right? It has a direct dyadic structuring of the corporate governance relation between executives and shareholders, which means that accountability becomes limited to the financial legal accountability to shareholders, which means that all other constituencies' interests become structurally excluded from the corporate governance debate, from the corporate governance agenda, right? So corporate governance becomes something which is only limited to the financial aspects of corporate governance in relation to what a board has in terms of its fiduciary duties towards its shareholders. So the implicit normativity that the UK code spreads around the world is that shareholder value is the exclusive compass for any company to thrive on, right? Legal becomes understood in this perspective within the narrowest confines of the law. It's not a broad perspective on what legal is or what moral is. I mean, morals have got nothing to do with this. Public and political condemnation can be ignored simply because you don't have to go beyond that very narrow perspective of what direct mandatory compliance with the code means, right? And the broader perspective of constituencies' interests get ignored as well. And obviously, even if you would look at institutional investors, you find that institutional investors are not oriented towards firms. They are typically invested in the market, right? They hold shares. They are not directly interested in control in the company. They're interested in having shares and having returns on those shares, right? So corporate governance theory tells them that they should be looking for shareholder value. The external valuation of those funds that they hold is also done through shareholder value. Strategy setting is done through shareholder value. Fund managers' KPIs are set in terms of their capacity to produce shareholder value. The investment chains that all that money goes through is actually oriented around shareholder value. And obviously, the identification of a large set of different end beneficiaries' goals would be very, very problematic. So there is no specific reason to look towards institutional investors as the guardians of a broader perspective on what corporate governance could be, right? And we find that happening very clearly in the Kraft Cadbury takeover case, right? Where Cadbury actually had a set of long-term investors as a sort of a firewall against short-term investment and short-term goals being set in relation to the strategy. But once the price went up, obviously all those long-term investors had to sell off one by one because, well, you know, the shareholders were being served best by the fact that they would be selling off, and therefore the firewall broke down, which meant that at some point Cadbury simply had to give in and had to sell out to Kraft, even though they didn't want to in the beginning. At the same time, we find that there's a very weak perception of what a board is, or why a board should have a very specific role in a company, right? Whereas we have very strong managers and executives. And because managers tend to get paid through stock options and large remuneration packages, it means that their alignment would generally shift from the company perspective toward the shareholders' perspective, right? So what I would argue is that there's a general failure to recognize something like enlightened self-interest by boards and executives, and also by institutional investors. Clear example, exec remuneration, right? This has been on the agenda for decades. The 1995 report, Greenberg Committee, public and shareholder concerns about the pay and other remuneration of company directors in the United Kingdom. This is how long ago? 22 years, right? What do we see, right? It's clear, right? So, and the effects of this are obviously huge, right? They're huge also in terms of the public perception of what companies are and for whom they operate, right? This is where the money goes. In 2014, the World Economic Forum produced a report in which they said that that severe income disparity was the 4th biggest risk to the world economy. And yet, you know, nothing changes. We have obviously the example of taxation and the problem of what happened there in the last year. And then the last problem with the UK code, I think, is, and especially in relation to the way that it gets spread around the world, is that it sort of presents the image that soft law is about having no law at all. But in the specificity of the UK context, enforcement is not absent; it just becomes informal, right? So there's an assumption that strong informal private enforcement would be the flip side of weak formal private enforcement, right? So suasion rather than sanction is the order of the day. In that particular idea, soft law is not the absence of control, but the belief that the most effective type of regulation can be found in the capacity of elite agents and their informal and embedded position to provide informal guidance to business elites, right? It's been recognized in the UK now that that's becoming increasingly difficult because of foreign investment coming into the UK, which means that you obviously can't just go to your club and tell somebody else, well, you know, not very happy with what you've been doing, right? So if we assume that soft law is the absence of mandatory regulation, we have to take into account that the specificity of the development of soft law assumptions in relation to corporate governance through the UK code is implicitly making use of a very different schema, right, which is very UK-centric. So soft law may provide certain benefits, right? More effective to deal with uncertainty, especially when it initiates processes that allow actors to learn about the impact of agreements over time, right? There's a long-term perspective implicit to it. It facilitates compromise, mutually beneficial cooperation between actors with different interests and values, different time horizons and discount rates, and different degrees of power, right? However, what we find in relation to the UK code and its position in relation to soft law is that it's problematic on the empirical level. It's problematic on the normative level. It structurally excludes other constituencies and interests, and it doesn't make use of enlightened self-interest on the part of the main parties involved. And it's got problematic application in the transnational domain because it spreads an explicit idea which is not consistent with the practicality of the UK setting, right? So Martin Luther King said that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated, right? So I'm going to make an explicit point here that hard law is actually the way forward, right? So the empirical point means that non-compliance invites consideration of stronger interventions by regulatory authorities, whereas the normative point means that the shareholder value normativity invites regulation to protect other constituencies' interests. And explicit mandatory regulation is what I mean, right? So we need to go beyond the code. We need to look at how hard law can be used to build institutions, to enable long-term strategies for companies, to enable investment in R&D. I mean, everybody who's been reading Lazonic knows that this has been declining over decades now. How we can achieve a regulatory level playing field, how we can protect innovation within companies over the long run. I can't show you this, I guess. But if you need any reason why...
I want to ask you a few questions. What do you say to that single pregnant woman who might have AIDS, no income, and she needs Daraprim in order to survive? Say to her when she has to make that choice, what do you say to her?
On the advice of counsel, I invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination and respectfully decline to answer your question.
Do you think you've done anything wrong?
On the advice of counsel, I invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination and respectfully decline to answer your question.
I'd like to yield time to Congressman Gowdy of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it pronounced Shkreli?
Yes, sir.
See, there you can answer some questions. I just want to make sure you understand, you are welcome to answer questions, and not all of your answers are going to subject you to incrimination. You understand that, don't you?
I intend to follow the advice of my counsel, not yours.
I want to ask you I want to plead with you to use any remaining influence you have over your former company to press them to lower the price of these drugs. You can look away if you like, but I wish you could see the faces of people, no matter what Ms. Retzlaff says, who cannot get the drugs that they need. Rightly or wrongly, you've been viewed as the so-called bad boy of pharma. You have a spotlight, and you have a platform. You could use that attention to come clean, to right your wrongs, and to become one of the most effective patient advocates in the country, and one that can make a big difference in so many people's lives. I know you're smiling, but I'm very serious, sir. And I truly believe, are you listening?
Yes.
Thank you. I truly believe you could become a force of tremendous good. Of course, you can ignore this if you like, but all I ask is that you reflect on it. There's so many people that could use your help. May God bless you. Thank you.
Well, I'm not a company lawyer, but I'll rest my case.
Okay, Yaron has summarized the phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, but we don't know what's broke, so we can't fix what we don't know, is it? All right, so here's put up some interesting views. Can I solicit some views from the floor? Any questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the talk. I found it really interesting. It might sound like quite a basic, obvious question, but when I've read through some of these things, it always keeps on coming back to me, this basic principle really. And obviously when you look at the comply or explain approach in the UK and the empirical studies, it seems that the explain part is not working that well with the problems with disclosure and the boilerplate statements and so on. So if you have to explain to students or to whoever, why do you think is disclosure so important in this context? I do agree with what you've said. I just want to, some people argue it's the long-term views, others say it's to keep the shareholders informed. So if you look at if you look at a comply or explain approach and you link it then to disclosure, how would you explain the importance of disclosure in this context?
Well, one of the obvious way forward would be to look at ESG reporting and at integrated reporting and to see how you can actually include many factors that would actually look towards different constituencies' interests to make them part of mandatory reporting. So disclosure in that sense would mean very much, I believe, in line with what you've just been arguing, that you could actually report on a much wider set of issues rather than just financial aspects of corporate governance, and also make the importance of that wider disclosure central to the way that you think about corporate governance in the long run and in relation to the interest of the company as a whole, right? It's a rather bland answer, but yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, Jaron. Again, I agree with your observations, but one of the things I was wondering is the fact that the corporate governance code in Cadbury is based on the existence of a strong institutional investor body in the City of London and so on. But now it seems like the nature of shareholders within UK companies has also changed. There's a lot of foreign shareholding and so on. So I was wondering whether the composition of shareholders, whether institutional or otherwise, has a role to play in the success or failure of a code, and to what extent is that important, and how has that changed in the UK over a period of time? Again, I think this probably supports your argument, but that will be useful as well.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about specificity of the UK situation is that they have taken shareholder value extremely seriously, in the sense that they've really done away with almost all the protections that you could ever have to insulate boards against takeovers, including foreign takeovers. As a result, most of the public companies in the UK are now held by foreigners rather than by local investors. So, I mean, I think they are waking up to the fact that that has concrete implications for the implicit model that they've built. And they still look towards institutional investors as the ones that would be able to do the behind-the-scenes control over boards. And they increasingly find that it's really difficult to maintain that implicit idea. But obviously, once you move away from there, you also move away from elite regulation, which in the UK context is tricky.
Hi. Yes. In connection to what you mentioned, that institutional shareholders are not achieving the monitoring objectives that they are supposed to achieve, have you seen any change in after the code on stewardship was enacted in the UK?
I think there has been follow-up research on it. Actually, John Montgomery was central to the drafting of the stewardship code as one of the visiting professors at Cass. Well, I think it works the other way around. I think that the fact that they needed the stewardship code to remind the institutional investors is the most telling part of the way that it's the fact that it's not working.
And has there been a positive reaction on the part of institutional investors?
Well, I guess if you want to maintain the system that you have, yes, you need to have institutional investors on board, because they are central to having some sort of a shareholder influence that would also produce some sort of a long-termism, as in the K review, right? So you need that party to be directly and actively involved in your corporate governance, in a way that corporate governance is actually instituted in your country. Yes.
Well, that's Andrew, and one more question after that, in the interest of time.
Mine will be very brief. Do you think that there's any role, not leaving aside the code, but any role at all for voluntary regulation in the UK's corporate setup, or even in the setup of any other jurisdiction?
Well, to be fair, I think, well, I would sort of agree with Jill that if boards take disclosure seriously, if they have a long-term perspective on the company, then obviously mandatory regulation, or sorry, voluntary regulation or soft law regulation is the best way forward, because you don't want to constrain those people. You want to support their initiative. You don't want to sort of, force something through the throat that they won't accept anyway, etc., etc. So I accept that. I accept that way of thinking. However, at some point after we've been 25 years at this now. At some point, you just have to take stock. You have to find that, if it doesn't work, you may have to rethink whether what you have put on the table is still the most valid way forward. And I guess for many companies, for many boards, they just haven't grasped the chance they have been given by Cadbury and many of the institutions that supported that code. That would be my assessment of it.
We have one more question.
Very interesting ending in particular, I think. I mean, coming on the other points that you made. And so you've presented a picture of an ethical problem, right? A person with a serious ethical problem. And I wonder whether, I mean, taking up some of the other work that we've discussed in other forums, going into I understand the argument that if we eliminate shareholder ownership, or the concept that shareholders are owners of shares, and that dislodges part of the shareholder value argument. But it seems to me that taking that tack is a bit of a distraction because your conclusion preceding the presentation from C-SPAN goes to hard law, and the hard law would be clear decisions that certain things are important for society, and that certain uses of property should be made, and attaching duty to ownership in the long run, I think would bear much more fruit than making a quite weak legal argument that actually no one owns corporations, because then the second argument brings you back to the first step I mentioned, which is making hard decisions about how property should be used. And in this case, it would be assigning the property to somebody, whether it's the state or someone else. So I think with hard law, the ethical concerns should be addressed, and I'm wondering how you respond to that. Thanks.
Oh yeah, well, thanks for that question. Obviously, the answer is huge. We could spend another conference talking about it. I'm not so sure the argument is weak in the sense that obviously Bellarmine's arrived at exactly the same conclusion, but from a more pragmatic point of view. Okay, my position would be that if you're going to have a public corporation, that institutes a particular set of trade-offs between different constituencies. Shareholders obviously got their limited liability, but they also got they got protection against each other, right? Which was a very clear setup at the time. What happened through having a separate legal entity was that you also had other constituencies get more or different positions in relation to that separate legal entity. That's why I said that the position of boards is typically weakly conceived, but boards are absolutely central to any conception of what a public corporation is or should be. So perhaps one of the ways forward, or at least one of the more fruitful ways to think through these things here, it's actually provided by Leo Strine, right? Leo Strine has been arguing this point that, well, you shouldn't go to the company if you're going to accept shareholder value. You shouldn't go to the company to actually institute all sorts of protections for other constituencies. You have to regulate for it, right? You have to keep it external. That is a clear, a consistent way of reasoning in relation to public corporations. And then you can have a strong board, and the board can actually relate to all these different constituencies. I can live with that. That's a fine way moving forward, to my mind at least, because it sort of takes into account most of the issues that we talk about. But it's very, very different from the assumptions that you have underlying the UK code, right? So, yeah, but we should have a different symposium about it.
On that note, let's thank Lauren again.